our countdown slides. Can you just raise your hand so I can know if we have new people here or not? We have a few.
I don't know.
There is a sign-in sheet that you can put your email address on so that you can hear more about what we're doing if you are interested. We are a Common Grounds community. We got together about a year and a half ago. Started with concern about the community and the division that we see going on and how to rectify that. We decided the best way to do that is education, so everybody can be on the same page. There's a lot of, I don't know if you realize this, but the way our computers work these days, you get fed the same information. You're not getting different sides of things. So we have to make a concerted effort to do this. We have some upcoming events on the yellow sheet of paper. If you would take a few moments to look at that or write it down. June 2nd, we're going to talk about voting. And this is how it works from start to finish. So it's, you know, how easy is voter fraud? How possible is that? How are the ballots counted? What are what are the processes that are put in place to keep from things being miscounted, et cetera? And then July 14th, we have immigration. Immigration is not about whether it's right or wrong, but do we really have a good idea of how people come into the country? You know, what are the different avenues they take? What is the process with those various avenues? So, and we find out that people are more under-documented than they are undocumented. And then August 4th, we're going to talk about data centers. And there's been a lot of talk about that in this area. Also, May 11th and May 19th. Was anyone here for the Lisa Cobb? Yeah. She's going to come back just to like gather groups to process what is going on and help people come up with strategies to relax and, you know, work through some of the issues. So, welcome. We're glad you're here. Julie's going to introduce our speaker and enjoy.
I don't know if you've been here before to see Professor Takitaki, but we are very honored because he is not only a wealth of knowledge, but he is from Ferris State University, and he is a lecturer, coordinator of the Political Science Program, director of the Political Engagement Project, and serves on the executive board of the Academic Senate. And I think you'll be able to find him very enjoyable to listen to. But first, I'm going to read a poem. If you've been to these before, you know that I like to write poetry, but this one, I was thinking about the Pledge of Allegiance. I mean, we all say it from the time we're in kindergarten, and I was thinking, do we really ever listen to the words that we pledge to? So my poem is I pledge, but listen closely. I pledge allegiance. Wait, do you hear it, or you just say it? I pledge allegiance to the flag, stars stitched in stories, stripes soaked in sacrifice, a banner that has seen both bravery and broken promises. Of the United States of America, not just land, not just borders, but people, all people, at least that's what we said it meant. And to the republic which it stands. But tell me, are you still standing, or are you just holding on? One nation, indivisible. Indivisible. Say it again, indivisible. Then look around. At the lines we draw, the sides we pick, the way we sharpen words into weapons and call it freedom. Under God, or under conscience, or under something bigger than ego, whatever you name it, you give it, is meant to humble us, not divide us. With liberty, not for some, not when it's convenient, but when it's profitable, not when it's profitable, but liberty that breathes in every voice, even the ones we don't like. And justice for all, not most, not if they agree, not if they look like us, pray like us, vote like us, all. So I pledge allegiance, but not blindly. I pledge to remember what those words were supposed to build, not just because they would come. A pledge to question when we drift from indivisible into pieces. I pledge to stand not for a perfect country, because perfection was never the promise, but for the possibility of it. because we're still here, still speaking, still choosing, and that means we're still, each of us, responsible. I pledge allegiance not to a direction we're drifting, but to a direction we can still change. And with that, we'll have this.
All right, I'm going to use this microphone for the sake of the camera in the back and for the sake of anybody who might not be able to hear my voice. Hello, class. Welcome to Civics 101. I was asked to come here today and kind of encapsulate what is essentially something like 16 weeks worth of content in a very short amount of time. And I want to tell you that it's thrilling for you to look around the room and think maybe for the first time in my recent academic career, I will have a class where not everyone's going to be on their phone from time to time. Just that being said, we do want to make sure those things are silenced for the sake of your classmates in the videos, just in case. Here is what we're about today. We are specifically about clicking on this and making sure it works. One moment. That's not moving. Let's try this. No, hold on. That's. I think we're locked up on the video here for just a moment. All right. I'm going to try to get this fixed. But what we're after today is the course syllabus, which comedically is about representation in public service, the 3 branches of government, levels of government, federal, state, and local, and the roles of elected officials. That's what the folks here at Common Ground asked me to come and talk about, and that is exactly what I intend to do. Let me, 1 second here, see if I can get this to reset. Hoping that one didn't. Let's see if we advance. Ready? No, we don't. All right, so I will see if we can get this going. Here is the first. Can you over here? Why is this not? Okay. 1 moment, please.
Talk amongst yourselves.
Right, yes, talk amongst yourselves.
About your high school civics.
There's cookies.
Everybody's
got government.
Hey, we fixed it. All right. Fantastic. So again, this is our course syllabus. We're going to be touching on each of these as we proceed. We're going to start with representation. We're going to end on public service to a great extent. But here is the first lesson for you today. The first lesson is this. We will try to draw, whenever possible, from original documents, specifically things like the Constitution. I use this question on my undergrad. I get the feeling I won't get quite as many bites in this room. But the first question is this. Does anybody have an idea? If you were to take the entirety of the U.S. Constitution, every article, every word, along with the entire Bill of Rights, every word, right, and print them out on a standard 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, 12-point font, maybe 14 for some, right? But print those out, how many pages you would need to get the entire Constitution, Bill of Rights, all of that kind of information out? Anybody have any idea? Right?
3,
3, 20, 5, 6. I get students who will regularly come to me and say 200, 300, right? And the answer is about 21, 22. Right? 21 to 22 pages. I will joke with my students and say it's something that you can read on a particularly long trip to the bathroom if necessary. Right? It is not an unapproachable document. It is incredibly compact, it's incredibly dense. Some of the things in it are incredibly meaningful and have 200 years of precedent around them. But one of the first things I can say about civics is that we as citizens need to get ourselves and our neighbors comfortable with the actual documents. Not the way they have been necessarily interpreted by your favorite talking head from either side of the ideological spectrum, but familiar with the fundamental documents, because from that, we will be able to arrive at a much more comprehensive understanding of what our roles and responsibilities are and what our opportunities are as citizens. Speaking of opportunities, representation is our first topic on the syllabus. When I say representation, I'm talking about one's capacity to serve in public office. But as it turns out, there are different theories of representation that will inform everything we talk about moving forward. I have a question for you. Do you want your representative to do exactly what you think they should be doing at all times? Some of us do. Some of us do. I mean, let's be honest. Some people do, in fact, want their representative to follow their precise preferences in terms of political positioning. However, that is not, in fact, the only or even the most frequent theory of representation. The first theory is that delegate model, right? And the delegate model suggests that a representative should do exactly what your people want, regardless of whether or not what they want maybe is what they need. Think about the paternalism in that idea, right? Imagine for a moment someone who's put into a position of public trust that looks at you and says, you know what, I understand you want this policy, but no, I don't think that's not what you need. Think about that for a moment. The delegate model avoids that promise or that problem by essentially saying, you just do what your people want. Whether or not what they want is necessarily good for them, whether or not it's good for the country as a whole, the delegate model of representation is based around that core idea that you just represent the interests and the will of your people. And if you think about it, there can be some justification for that, right? This person is representing you, they were elected by you, they should be doing some element of your will. The next model changes that. The trustee model is a different concept of representation. And the trustee model essentially empowers the representative as someone who is skilled in their own right, experienced, knowledgeable, and asks that trustee to do exactly what we just said you might not want them to do. To make decisions on your behalf for your benefit, even if they don't necessarily line up with what you want, without, potentially in violation of your articulated preferences. Now, you can imagine that if you had two people campaigning to win your vote, and one of them were to describe themselves as a delegate, and the other were to describe themselves as a trustee, that difference alone might be enough to swing your preference and your vote. Now, as it turns out, these are not models of representation that are held in a vacuum, and the Politico model encapsulates what a good number of relatively competent, responsible representatives do on a regular basis. And essentially, it's this. You may not have an articulated preference in terms of policy on every single issue. There might be things you just don't know about, things you don't feel that you have enough information to make an individual decision on, things that you might effectively ask your expert representative to figure out for you. And the Politico model attempts to allow your representative to do that, right? While still answering to your whim, to your preference, in any circumstance in which that is something that is strongly articulated, right? So the Politico is seen as a midpoint between that delegate and trustee models. Perhaps most relevant to the way in which our current political environment is shaking out is this last one. And this has become an increasingly evident and prevalent model of representation, and that's the partisan model. Now, the partisan model says you stay loyal to your political party and the leadership within that party. You actually see the partisan model more frequently used in ways that are positive in large multi-party systems, in which the party itself might be articulating a set of specific policies or platforms and is competing with multiple other parties, and in which you voting as a part of that partisan bloc is how you get those issues to advance forward in an otherwise multi-party legislative system, frequently a parliamentary system. In our system, this looks a lot different. We have fundamentally a two-party system. Why? Is it because the Democrats and Republicans got in early and rigged the game and just set it up that way so that there can only be two parties? The answer is no. That's not why we have a two-party system. In fact, you could argue that neither the Democrats or Republicans in their current form was present when the core elements that create this two-party system were put into our American political documents and traditions. The short answer is we have two parties because of math. This is an effect that we in the political science world call the Duverger effect. And it is the idea that if you have a single member majoritarian system, right? So essentially you elect one person from a district or a rider, and they require a majority vote to secure that seat, you will always end up with two parties, regardless of how many you start with, regardless of how many else come in. Because the pressures mathematically to win that seat require you to get 50% plus one. And if someone is able to successfully assemble a coalition to 50% plus one, the only way you can beat that is to get the other 49.9 and fight over the middle. right? It is math that gives us a two-party system in this country. If you were to have other ways of election, if you were to have multi-party, multi-member elections, you could immediately see variance from the two-party model. And we do see it when we have that. Even something like, were you to try to elect the senators from each state simultaneously instead of separately, you could feasibly see the opportunity for multi-party success. But it is that mathematical constant that always kind of reverts us back to two parties. A new party might come up and displace an old party. We've seen that before with things like the Whig Party, the rise of the Republican Party, right? Even temporarily, we had things like the Bull Moose. But we will always, in this mathematical system, revert back to two parties. So the partisan model in this system becomes more problematic than it is in other systems in which you might have parties that are galvanized around issues and can maintain minority positions across the board. Frequently, because of things like strategic voting, that partisan model can actually damage your position, because you are very likely to pull voters out of the party that is otherwise closest to your ideological position and empower the one on the opposite side of the line by not merging with the party that is otherwise closest to you. So that partisan model is an important thing to think about as we move forward and we start talking about the rest of this conversation. Because we're about to pivot to our federal government and our methods of representation that exist there. Again, Constitution check, get comfortable with these documents, long bathroom trip, you can read it, okay? In fact, if you'd started when I first mentioned that, you'd be halfway through it by now, okay? So, the first article of the Constitution, Article 1, specifies our legislative branch. It is Congress. Civics 101, what does Congress do? Congress makes laws. And it should be noteworthy that Congress was seen at the time of the founders and through many other democratic systems ever since as the prime and most important body in the government. Right? Not that there are not co-equal branches, not that there are not checks and balances, but that Congress was the place where the core elements of democracy were to happen. Because Congress is and was designed to be the most small d democratic institution in our federal government. Why and how? Well, let's take a look at how Congress is constructed. There are two houses in Congress. It's what we call bicameral. And those two houses are known as the House of Representatives and the Senate. All right? The House of Representatives, the lower house, often referred to as the People's House, is a body that is populated by states. The states themselves each get an apportionment of seats in Congress. There are a total of 435 seats available in Congress, and that number is fixed. That number has been fixed, and that's really important, because that means that shifting population trends across the United States can cause states to gain or lose power as they become more or less populous in comparison to their neighbors. Now imagine you had 435 seats at a point in time in which the country had, let's say, 100 million people. That would mean that each congressperson is representative for 1/100th of 435, 1/100th of the total population, approximately, all the way around. At 250 million people, you have a lot more people per congressperson, right? At now 330-ish million people, there are even more people per congressperson. Population trends across the United States have seen states like ours, Rust Belt states, states in the northern part of the country, lose population to southern states and western states. Although we now have seen another pattern of people leaving western states also moving towards broader settlements in the American South. The South has been the thing that has been gaining the most population. In the previous census, we saw Michigan actually lose a seat and require the reapportionment of our congressional districts. So that's the important thing to think about when you think about the math of Congress, right? There's 435 of them total. Doesn't matter how many people are in the United States, there's going to be 435 members of Congress, barring constitutional amendment. Which means that if the population of Texas increases significantly, there will be more representatives from Texas. California goes up, it goes up. We get a renaissance here in Michigan, Michigan will gain more representation in Congress. The next thing that's important to know about this House of Representatives is that by constitutional language, it contains what we call the power of the purse. It is the place in which any bills regarding spending must originate. And so when we think about the way in which these budget matters are so crucial for our overall perspective on government and the operation of government, right? Congress, specifically in the House of Representatives, is where those budget bills must originate. Also remember that because of the fact that you have congressional delegations, the congressional delegations themselves and each individual congressperson is elected out of a geographic district. And in today's particular moment, those districts are a hot item of conversation, because those districts are not necessarily drawn with fairness or an absence of bias in mind. This is another characteristic that is common amongst these single-member majoritarian systems, in that whoever draws those district lines can frequently control who actually runs Congress in terms of a partisan majority. Now, we did something here in Michigan not that long ago called the Michigan's Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission, which actually took the power of redistricting out of the hands of our state legislators and put it into a bipartisan and technically nonpartisan panel of citizens. They redistricted the state of Michigan and brought it closer to what we would consider to be parity. Now, by parity, I mean that the total number of votes and the total number of party support more or less translates into the total number of seats apportioned within the state. Previous to that reapportionment, the seats in Michigan had been gerrymandered. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, gerrymander is what happens when you build the seats in such a way that it really favors one party. It's named after a guy named Eldridge Gerry, who was a governor in the early American times, who specifically kind of put his imprimatur behind this idea of manipulating district lines in order to succeed in gaining partisan majorities, even perhaps when the people aren't behind you. So gerrymandering is something you have to consider and worry about in the House of Representatives. You don't have to worry about it in the Senate, because the Senate is elected statewide. The traditional compromise, right, the great kind of Madisonian compromise that put together these two houses was the result of debates in the early American times about whether or not representation should be based on statehood or on population. Larger states at the time, states like Virginia, wanted it to be based on population, where they would have a mechanical advantage over a much smaller state, let's say like Rhode Island. It's noteworthy that at the time that some of these conversations were happening, the borders of Virginia extended across the country because there weren't other states to the west. So Virginia had a northern border, a southern border, the eastern border along the Atlantic, and the western border would technically be in modern day times as California, right? Straight band across the country. And you can imagine little landlocked Rhode Island was not pleased with the idea of it being based off of population, because they would be rendered completely irrelevant in short order. Even larger states, more relevant states at the time, states like Massachusetts, who had western borders, were immediately in opposition to that idea. And so the compromise that came about that established both of these was that you'd have one house based off of population and another house based off of statehood. Well, Senate is the one based off of statehood. Everybody gets 2 senators. Which means that, in some ways, the Senate is inherently a disproportionate body. Now, that's something that we accept, but it is also something that is pretty hotly contested and debated nowadays. Why? Well, because you might have a state like Texas, in excess, I believe, of 30 million citizens at this point in time, or California, in excess of 50 million citizens at this time, each of which have 2 senators. Wyoming, whose population, I believe, at this moment is under 750,000 total, also has 2 senators. So one senator from Wyoming is representing about 350,000 people, and one senator from California is representing something like 27 million people. Now, that kind of math seemingly undermines some of that core small d democratic idea that these bodies, these entities, should be representing the people equally, and that's an important debate to continue discussing, right? In fact, the Senate has a long history of being significantly out of step with kind of our modern ideas of what small d democracy should look like. It is not until the 17th Amendment in 1913 that you, as a citizen, would vote for a senator at all. The Senate used to be elected not by the people, but by the state representatives. That's how you got your senators, right? So we'll talk about later as we talk about the distribution within federalism, but that you would elect a state rep, they'd go off to Lansing, and they would decide who your senators are. Not you, there's no ballot, right? You are empowering them to make that decision by the original construction of the Constitution. And if you look at the math, we're just now getting to the point where we've done them direct elections longer than we did them that way. So be aware that the Senate is a body that is inherently disproportionate. And at one point in time was far less multi-democratic than it is today. And there are still arguments about whether or not the Senate should be shifted, whether or not it should necessarily represent population. We'll get some more of that when we get to federalism and the idea of shared sovereignty. The other thing that the Senate has in terms of significant powers is the power to advise and consent. Right? The Senate must approve international treaties. The Senate must approve most presidential appointments, things like cabinet appointments, and appointments to the Supreme Court. And I'm going to put this to you in a way that's as kind as I can, right? But this description of the Senate's powers is pretty elitist. Think about this. Under the original conception of the American system, the people did not have a direct voice in deciding those individuals who would be most significant in doing things like approving treaties, the president's international conduct, or in populating the Supreme Court, or in deciding who the Secretary of Commerce, or depending on its terminology, defense or war might be. Those would be high-ranking, significant officials in charge of significant portfolios in the federal government, whose nomination, whose progress would be very far removed from the idea of you and me going into a ballot box or at a voting box somewhere and filling out a ballot. And so when we look at the constitutional language that creates this institution, we need to see where it started and also see where it is. You're going to notice a pattern here over the next couple of slides. And that is that there is a section in the beginning of these constitutional articles that describe this, but eventually we get to something really important where it starts talking about powers that these individual bodies have. And in this case, the enumerated powers of Congress are laid out in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. That idea of enumerated powers is going to be really important here over the next several slides. Because enumerated powers are where the Constitution specifically empowers Congress to do things. You can imagine there might be circumstances in which Congress might decide it wants to do something, maybe it thinks it even needs to do something, but it's not in that list. For example, how does Congress regulate algorithms and artificial intelligence models? They didn't exist at the time. We had no idea, right? How might Congress do something about things like space exploration? Right? We don't know, right? Depending on where you particularly sit, there are social trends. There are trends in terms of human equality, right? That were essentially forbidden from conversation and not on the radar for many of the people in the founding age, right? That have become very relevant nowadays. And so if the Congress doesn't have that kind of specifically enumerated power, how do we deal with these things? Well, one of the things that allows us to deal with these things is something that's called the necessary and proper clause. And that gives the Congress the ability, right, to do what is necessary and proper to carry out its fundamental responsibilities to the American people. There's a lot of complex controversy that has to do with that necessary and proper clause. One of them right now that may be worth taking a brief segue to talk about is the idea that sometimes Congress makes legislation that's pretty vague. Right? It may articulate principles, it may illustrate or otherwise put out goals. And for the longest time, it has fallen to various different elements of the American bureaucracy to take that legislation and then do something with it. Well, we've recently seen a core Supreme Court decision, right, in Roper v. Raimondo, that has removed that power, essentially, from many of these administrative organizations and entities within the executive branch. Essentially saying you no longer have the power to interpret Congress's whim by policy. So this is one of those areas that we're going to be very interested in moving forward as political scientists. Because before, something like the either the EPA, right, or another body within the federal government could look at Congress's thing and then figure out how to actually make that work. Now we're in an age in which that power, that specific power to interpret and extrapolate and generate policy, has essentially been rescinded through an act of the Supreme Court. And so our legislative agenda, our legislative branch, the functions of it are ever evolving and changing, both in terms of their small d democratic impact and in the way in which it functions on a day-to-day basis. This is not a fixed thing. If you learned this in civics in high school, I guarantee you it's different now, right? Because it was different a year ago when I last taught. So, this is the representative branch. This is the legislative branch. Total of 535 human beings, 435 in the House, 100 in the Senate. Grand total, right? 535. That is Congress. If we move on to Article 2, we get to the presidency. Now, Article 2 is shorter than Article 1. This ends up being controversial for big reasons we'll get into in just a moment. But the executive power of the United States is vested in the presidency. Specifically, using that language, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. That is known as the vesting clause. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you know what executive power is? Because there's not necessarily agreement on that point, and that's really, really important. Fortunately, the Constitution does do in Article 2 what it does in Article 1, and continues on to a list of enumerated powers for the president. But it's a really short list, right? It creates the president as the commander-in-chief, establishing civilian control over the military. It says that the president shall negotiate treaties, they shall make appointments, and they are allowed to make recess appointments should there be a vacancy in one of the houses during a break, a recess of the House or Senate. It also commands that the president needs to address the Congress from time to time, right? Which has largely led to the tradition that we know as the State of the Union. And that's about it. That is about the extent of the enumerated powers given to the presidency in the Constitution. End of list. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that there can be wild disagreement over what the president should or can be doing. You've got two words in that sentence upon which all definitions hinge: vested and executive. That's all. Now, vested, most people can agree, means placed or otherwise embodied, right? I have vested this power in you. It is yours to use. But what executive means is a big, big controversy. You may have become familiar with various different theories of executive power. I want to touch on the idea that there are some very legitimate scholars who look at the historical context of this document, who look at the will of the founders who themselves were kind of working against the idea of royalty, right? Who believe, fundamentally, that aside from ensuring that the laws passed by Congress are carried out and performing these specific enumerated duties, the president has no additional power. That's it. Congress makes the laws, they're the primary branch, you do what, you make sure that those things are carried forward into policy, right? Make sure that's happening in accordance with their dictates. You provide civilian command for the military, you negotiate treaties, you make appointments, you give a speech to Congress. That's it. That's the end of your portfolio by a very strict reading, but one that is supported by both historical and constitutional language. Most political scientists and scholars use a more expanded definition of the executive, right? That empowers the president to do things like, set additional policies within the various different agencies and cabinet members throughout the executive branch, right? to kind of more forcefully and more whole-chestedly articulate an agenda for the United States, much like we would now understand most kind of governors or many of our previous presidents. You may have heard something called the unitary executive theory, all right? The unitary executive theory suggests that the president has very broad sweeping powers. In fact, the idea that the powers of the president can only be constrained under very, very, very limited circumstances informs some people's contestant or kind of a conception of this unitary executive theory. And even beyond the unitary executive theory, there's a theory that has been dubbed by political scientists to be the royal residuum theory. And the royal residuum theory effectively states that the president and the executive branch has, unless specifically and documentedly being opposed or countered by the Congress or the Supreme Court, near plenary power. Plenary power is another way of saying absolute power in this context. So contrast for just a moment the very narrow, limited, constitutionally kind of prescribed idea of the president as a narrow executive versus almost absolute power. And understand that there are people across the American diaspora who believe wholeheartedly that somewhere along that line is where presidential power must be. Now, unsurprisingly, the current administration and many of those people who support it are much closer to the unitary executive or the royal residuum theory of power, as has recently become our Supreme Court. And the thing that really makes this interesting for our analysis at this point in time of executive power is the Supreme Court decision in Trump v. United States 2024. Because previous to that Supreme Court decision, there was no legal or constitutional precedent whatsoever for the idea of criminal immunity on the part of the executive. We had Supreme Court statements and elements within statute law that provided a civil immunity for the president, meaning that if the president sent your son or husband or daughter or wife off to war and they died, you could not sue the president for damages or like lifetime earnings or something like that, right? Even though it was their decision to put them into that kind of combat. You couldn't do that, right? But the idea that the president could be held criminally responsible for any kind of law breaking that was being done during their term of office was a long established precedent. Trump v. United States fundamentally changed that presumption and granted what is sweeping and almost unquestionable legal immunity to the president, because the premise is that any action taken in the presidency or that is specifically related to the presidency is now presumptively immune from any kind of criminal investigation, including the inability to subpoena records for any kind of investigation. This creates a standard of immunity that transcends anything we've had in the constitutional history of this country, and really does shift at least that aspect of it, or that aspect of the conception of presidential power, much closer to the unitary executive or the royal residuum. Because if there are not legal consequences for a president's actions, then feasibly the only check on their power is a political one through the mechanism of impeachment. And that would imply that there is a significantly larger concentration of power in the presidency than might have otherwise been previously understood. I see a hand, I'll call it.
Significantly, at least to me, 30 to 40 years ago, the first time it was put into writing by an actual federal employee was a gentleman named Samuel Alito. Then in the Department of Justice, in a branch of it that was in charge of analyzing policy, and he's been an advocate for his own theory of a unitary executive ever since, as he rose through the federal judiciary, where he now sits on the Supreme Court.
Yeah, that's a useful thing to point out, that this idea of a unitary executive, while there has always been some debate as to what exactly that executive power should consist of or needs to consist of for the efficient operation of the country, the specific unitary executive theory and its rise to predominance amongst large chunks of the American judicial and political class is a recent event, right? That is something that has happened in the last 30 to 40 years. There's a few other, and I don't know if we'll have time to get, there's a few other very new concepts that appear to be animating things like our Supreme Court that are worth considering as we work our way through this. But we're also, that's kind of maybe 201 or 301 stuff. We're going to try to get through 101 as best we can, all right? But this is the executive. Again, think about this idea of the variance in power here, right? That's one of the biggest things to think about. Obviously, the president, yes, they're elected to 4-year terms. We didn't talk about that in terms of Congress. Individual representatives have 2-year terms, right? Senators are 6-year terms. No term limits in the legislative, right? You can run as many times as people will let you at this point. Presidency, however, specifically limited to 2 4-year terms. And this came about after Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected to 4. Right? People are like, it's probably too much. That 2 basis, by the way, based off of the tradition of George Washington. Right? The idea was that Washington, some of the justification was there, if Washington served 2, 2 is enough for anyone. All right, so Article 2, executive branch, presidency. Brings us to Article 3, the third branch, the third tier in the American system of government, the judicial branch, the Supreme Court. It is Article 3 that lays out the Supreme Court power. And, much like Article 2, it's not that long. Right? Article 3 is a relatively short article. Here are the core things we need to think about with the Supreme Court. 1, judicial power is vested in one Supreme Court, right? And also, the Constitution allows for inferior courts as established by Congress. It was understood that this one court couldn't do everything, but they handed the Constitution gives the power to determine what additional courts need to exist to Congress, right? This is a check on the judiciary itself, but also many scholars read that as being yet another piece of evidence that suggests Congress was supposed to be kind of the prime mover in this. All right. Also, the terms of Supreme Court justices are not specifically described in the Constitution. What it is said is that the justices shall hold their offices during good behavior. Right? Now, that is a bit of a tricky term, and what's important to know is that under English common law, right, that term signified the idea that an appointment would be ongoing. That a person could be removed should they fall out of good behavior, and there are methods, standard impeachment mechanisms that would allow you to remove a Supreme Court justice, but that otherwise, they just keep going. And what that has meant is that has meant lifetime terms for Supreme Court justices in the United States. Noteworthy, these are not elected positions. Right? They are positions that are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Though it's also really interesting for us to consider the idea that the threshold for confirmation of the Senate has been messed with quite a bit. At one point in time, it was considered to be a 2/3 majority, and other times a supermajority of 60 votes. We're near a point at this point in time where confirmation for many of these offices is down to a simple majority of 50 votes. And generally, with the president's president's party controlling the vice presidency, sometimes it's exactly 50 votes. We'll get to that in a minute as to why the vice president is important there. Because, well, let's just talk about it, because one of the few duties of the vice president is that they also serve as the president of the Senate. This is largely a ceremonial role, but what it does allow them to do is break ties. Right? So if you have a 50-50 vote, if you've got a couple people out and it's 49-49, the vice president is the one who gets to step in and break ties in the Senate. And since normally that means that it's the party of the president, at least in the modern era, right? Vice presidents didn't used to run on a ticket with the president. At one point in time, the vice president was the runner-up. Right? That system changed over the years, as did much of the Electoral College, which we can touch on briefly as we get towards the latter half of the hour, because that's a 201 concept, but we can get to it if you're interested. Point being that the vice president's normally a reliable vote for the president's party. Right? So there is an advantage to having that person sitting in that capacity as the vice president of the Senate. Back to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has what is called both original and appellate jurisdiction. Original jurisdiction means that they have the right to hear cases, and in any case that involves, let's say, one state suing another, foreign entities or bodies, anybody suing the US government, the Supreme Court is the court of original jurisdiction. That's where you have to be heard, right? it also has appellate jurisdiction, meaning that any case being held at one of these other courts established by Congress can feasibly be appealed to the Supreme Court for an eventual final decision. Now, that appeal process is interesting in that it is not a guarantee. Just because I don't like the outcome of my lower court case and I want to appeal it to the Supreme Court does not mean the Supreme Court will take it up. Now, what does that mean? It means that you require at least 4 of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court to grant what's known as a writ of certiorari. That means the court will hear your case. Now, there are 7,000, give or take, applications to the Supreme Court every year. So about 7,000 people around the country, entities, right, will appeal their decision to the Supreme Court, hoping that the Supreme Court will issue a ruling that either overturns their case or otherwise changes the result for the case that they are appealing. Of those, depending on the session, the Supreme Court will grant a writ to between 100 and 150. Okay? So just because you want to take it all the way to the Supreme Court is by no means a guarantee it will be heard. The vast majority of cases appealed to the Supreme Court essentially get told no. Right? And those 100 or 150 cases go through a process by which oral arguments are made. Yes, ma'am. See you.
You say 100 to 150. Has that increased with their secret docket or whatever?
So the secret docket is an entire another measure. Generally, yes. Shadow docket. But yes, and the shadow docket, by the way, is also a very new thing. But in terms of the number of cases that are receiving some kind of an emergency injunction, that's what the shadow docket is kind of actually built into as. There does seem to be a modest uptick. It hasn't doubled or anything like that, but there has been a modest uptick in the total number of cases that are getting some kind of traction with the Supreme Court, right? So again, that is a new enough feature. We're talking about the last 15 years. That is a new enough feature that we may not be able to track that data over time. We don't know if that's going to be something that moves forward. There's also some questions about whether or not that emergency intercession shadow docket is going to remain constitutional. Of course, it's the Supreme Court that would have to decide that, which we're going to get to in just a second here, right? So the Supreme Court is given this original and appellate jurisdiction, right? But something happens in 1803 that changes the nature of the Supreme Court in this country and changes it to what we've seen right now. And that's that, according to the Constitution, while the Supreme Court has kind of preeminence in many ways, there is not a mechanism by which individual laws, not legal decisions having to do with law, but individual laws themselves as passed by Congress and signed by the President, could be determined to be in accordance with the Constitution. Because we're thinking about 2 different things here. There's the Constitution, remember, 20 some odd minutes or 20 some odd pages. And then there's what we call statute law. Statute law is all of the laws that have been passed by Congress. Right? Now those don't necessarily amend the Constitution, almost none of them do. But they create systems and rules by which the rest of us live that have the legal force of law. That's the whole idea. In a case known as Marbury v. Madison, the Supreme Court essentially decided for itself that it had the power to determine whether or not a statute law was constitutional or not. That power is called judicial review, and it's actually one of the things that the Supreme Court does more often than not nowadays. Right? This idea that the laws themselves, as passed by Congress, could be decided by any other body to be out of step with the Constitution. Prior to this concept, if the Congress had passed the law and the President had signed it, it would have the force of law. There was not initially a mechanism for judicial review. It's also interesting that many other countries, in the aftermath of this particular development, have created specific separate constitutional courts to carry out this function separate from their Supreme Court in terms of their judiciary and other legal systems. Constitutional courts are a separate function for a lot of other places. But in our system, because that is not an elucidated constitutional power, it is something that is created by this Marbury v. Madison decision, and it is a power the Supreme Court is functionally given to itself. We will do exercises in my class that essentially play out the idea that, you know, a rogue executive could essentially decide, you know what, I don't necessarily believe that the Supreme Court really has that power, and I'm going to discard every element of Supreme Court precedent. And if the executive were to make that decision, who could stop them? If you've just ruled out the Supreme Court and said we're not listening to them anymore, then you fall right back to the idea of impeachment, especially under the current legal framework. Right? So this idea that this is a non-illuminated, non-elucidated power from the Constitution that the court has taken on itself and it fills this massive and important role in our society is a potential vulnerability of this system that we want to kind of pay attention to as we go. The Supreme Court then issues decisions and opinions, and those opinions basically reshape now both the statute and legal system as we know it in this country. And there's a couple of important principles that's worth understanding, because we mentioned the Constitution as one source of document and law. We've mentioned now statute law, and the third one that really does shape our government and the systems within it is precedent. And the idea of precedent goes back to this Latin term, it's on here, it's stare decisis, essentially means to stand as decided. And the idea is that once the Supreme Court decides how a set or a system of laws works, or they make an interpretation on something's constitutionality, that should be the way it works moving forward. We should not undermine precedent, we should not flip things on their head, we should not make random changes depending on what the individual composition of the Supreme Court is from time to time. And that is what has created a great degree of continuity in our legal system, is that once the court decides something, other courts, lower courts, sometimes even lower courts will defer to each other, right? They will point at the Fourth Circuit decided this way, we will also decide it this way in this case in the Eighth Circuit or something along those lines, right? The legal system is based on the idea that you will get equal treatment under the law wherever you are. And so this concept of precedent is actually really important. That said, there are times in which precedent does get overturned. Sometimes that is due to a new and novel legal challenge. Sometimes that can be due to modifications to statute law. And sometimes that's due to just the idea that the justices want to do it. Right? There are folks who look at some of the recent decisions regarding reproductive rights as a specific and direct overturn of precedent. Right? There are other ones who might look to other decisions, such as the DC handgun law, right, as establishing a new precedent, and would look at any kind of modifications to what is a much more kind of libertarian conception of firearms possession as something that would overturn that precedent. Right? So again, regardless of one's political preferences or ideation, precedent does kind of lay a groundwork for individuals across the country and for courts across the country to make informed decisions about what the law is or should be held to be. When precedent starts getting overturned, that ground gets shaky. It gets porous. And that is a consequence of that kind of change. Now, you may find that some of those changes are warranted and welcome, and some of them are absolutely kind of a third rail forbidden. But understand that the concept of precedent and the consequences of undermining it transcend any of those individual issues or political preferences. This is a bedrock principle of the legal system that can cause significant instability once it starts getting challenged. And those are the three primary branches of the American federal government. Congress makes laws, the president and the executive branch feasibly execute those laws and enact them. Supreme Court interprets them and acts as the judiciary check. They issue precedent. Now they have this power of judicial review to review specifically whether or not laws and statutes or sometimes agency policy is in line with constitutional principles. And the total sum of those three governmental bodies really does, on a day-to-day, week-to-week matter, change what our lives look like. Sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, sometimes things like whether or not the president has the power to, under the War Powers Act, begin a war, right? Or whether or not they have to stop that war after 60 days in accordance with statute law, and how much kind of liability or flexibility the president has in that moment. That's exactly the kind of thing that is specifically governed by this intersection of what is the statute law, what is the executive power under Article 2, and what kind of constraints does the Supreme Court put on that statute law. So almost all of the major policies that we will talk about or that you will interact with in your daily life are intersectional between these three bodies, which means that a change in like the perception of presidential power, or a change in the nature of representation, or a change in the total kind of partisan loyalty amongst the representatives, or in the composition of the Supreme Court and its willingness to potentially overturn precedent. Any one of those things can make real big changes for laws on our federal level. And if you're tracking all of them simultaneously, you can get pretty overwhelming. But you can't even begin to track any of them unless you have the basics that we've just covered. So that is the federal level, and that was part of our mandate today. However, yes, sorry, sir?
I just have a question. When you were talking about the Supreme Court and the senators agreeing or okaying for a Supreme Court judge to take place, and there was a change in the supermajority, 60%, how did that happen?
So the approval or disapproval comes from the rules that the Senate and the Congress set for themselves. Right? At the beginning of every session, there is a set of rules that is agreed to by the Congress itself. There are some that are dictated by statute law, but most of the rest of them are basically rules that are established under parliamentary policy within the body of the Senate and the House.
And is that, it's voted on, and is that just majority rule?
Yeah, fundamentally, remember, these are majoritarian institutions, right? On a basic level, approval is approval, and approval is 50% plus one, right? Unless the rules change. Right? And there are moments in which the parliamentary systems and rules for both of those houses can deem something requiring a supermajority. And you can imagine that in more collegial times, that would serve as a check against, a rash decision, or just simply require a broader swath of the elected representatives to actually move something forward. What's really important, I think, too, along those lines is that our system, more than any other modern democracy, is designed, not necessarily functionally now, but designed to require massive consensus. All right? Imagine for a moment we use something we call veto gates in terms of political science. It goes something like this. If you were a super dictator, right? There's one veto gate, and it's whether or not you want it. Right? You are the only veto gate in the process. If you were a super dictator, but you also had, a super dictator, co-super dictator, you both had to agree, you could argue there are now two veto gates, right? You both have to agree. Well, some parliamentary systems will have something like 3 veto gates, right? It's got to get through the Prime Minister, it's got to get through the House of Commons, it's got to get through the House of Lords, and that's it. And since the Prime Minister is coming out of the House of Commons in some of these systems, that's not a huge gate, because they probably have a majority. They have to have a majority to be Prime Minister. Right? 3 veto gates. Getting a policy through the American system requires transcending about 10 veto gates. Okay? About 10 veto gates. That's if you don't include introduction as one of the veto gates. It's got to get through about 10, because it's got to get through your initial presentation in Congress. It's got to get through its committee. Normally then it has to get through the final approval and vote. But in between those two things, you have opportunities for the Speaker or the President to actually schedule those things. Right, or the committee chair to schedule those things, and there's a tremendous number of legislative measures that just die on the vine because they don't want to schedule. Right, so you've got to have at least the consent of the Speaker or the consent of the chair to even get it to move forward. And if you don't have that, that gives that single individual potentially an individual veto gate. Right, so you can have 5 just in one house, and then you have an appropriate 5 in the other house plus the president. So you're talking about multiple levels of veto gates to get anything through, which is sometimes why the process takes so long here. Right? And why everything that comes out of the back end of it kind of looks like sausage. Right? Because it's had to get ground up to get through all of these hurdles and these gates. Our system is designed to do that. Right? So the idea that there was once these high bars, right, you required 67 votes to approve an appointment, was the idea that you had to pick somebody that you could get 67 people behind. That person better have pretty impressive credentials, right? As that bar gets lower, those credentials change. As people get more partisan, those credentials change. So, this, in some ways, it's noteworthy to see the way in which this is a response sometimes to frustrations about the system, right? In which frequently partisan actors and sometimes even political activists are more interested in kind of moving the system to get what they want than moving their neighbors to agree. And that can be where we end up in places like this. So, yes, sir.
It's kind of a side question. I recently proposed to a township board to pass a resolution to encourage state conference to move something through the process instead of just letting it die.
Right.
Does that have any value?
So potentially, though it is not a mechanical value, it would be more a symbolic and an advocacy value. So we can talk about that here in just a second, because we're about to shift to core concepts in terms of federalism, right? The comment here, by the way, was this gentleman had just encouraged was a township board, you said? A township board to make a statement to the state legislature in order to move an issue forward, right? Not let it kind of die on the vine, right? Now, as we will discover here in just a moment, the township board does not have the power to compel the state legislature to do things. However, a resolution passed by a township board should have more and will carry more weight, especially amongst at least the representative from that township, right? Whoever has been elected to the state house or to the state senate from that township. And we'll get into why that works that way in here just a minute. So, we are a federalism. That is an important term because it implies a key element being shared between the federal and state governments. And that is sovereignty. Now, what is sovereignty? Right? Sovereignty is the right of rule. I am sovereign to one extent or another over my own body. You can argue that I am the sovereign of my household, at least on the days in which my wife lets me. I have a certain degree of control over those things. However, the sovereignty of the United States, by the Constitution, lies with the people. But that sovereignty is expressed co-equally to some extent or another between the federal government and the government of the states. That means that the federal government can't just reach in and knock aside state governments and do whatever it wants, right? And it means that the state governments can't just exceed or ignore federal authority. Sovereignty is shared. There is a right for each of them to govern different portions of our lives and in different ways. That sovereignty is important because if not for this kind of shared sovereignty, we could have ended up with a confederal system in which sovereignty is only held at the state level. In fact, we started with that under the Articles of Confederation for the most part. It's very weak federalism. And if you think about something like the current European Union, right, that's kind of a confederation. You still have sovereign states that have come together in some measure of political alliance. And the original architects of the Articles of Confederation kind of saw something more like that. On the flip side, you might have a unitary government, right? It could go the other way, in which there is no sovereignty at the state level. What does that mean? That means we could look like France. Now, France has, like, regional governments, right? But those regional governments are working under the auspice of the central government. They can't do something against them, right? How they're built, how they're set up is entirely by that central government. In this country, the federal government handles a bunch, the state government has a bunch, and there are some things the state government has the ability to do independent of the federal government. In fact, that's the whole point of the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment specifically says, and this is the entire 10th Amendment, by the way, right? The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. What does that mean? Well, it means that unless the Constitution says this is what Congress gets to do, or the Constitution says the states can't do it, the states can do it. That's what that means, right? unless it is something the Constitution specifically gives to Congress, or unless it's something the Constitution specifically says, no, states, you can't do this. It's under the state's power to do it. Now, the Congress prevents states from doing things like minting their own currencies, right? Or negotiating international agreements, right? It says, no, states, you can't do those things. Right? Now, the states also can't set up federal judiciary bodies, because that is a power that's specifically granted to Congress. But can the states set up their own judiciaries to function within their states? Of course they can. Right? Can the states create their own constitutions? They can and have. Can the states dictate spending, education, land use policy? Yeah. Right? This is that federalism point. In a unitary government, there would be usually large, broad mandates that are set by, in our case, it would be Washington. Right? That would essentially hand regional governments, like, these are your orders, right? Now, those governments can be empowered to make decisions, but they can't exceed the framework that's given to them by the central government. Here, it's a much different system. It's kind of it's a limited, but it's much more of a blank check. And understanding that idea of power sharing and reserving some powers, but also granting others, is going to be very important for our understanding of the way that not only the federal government relates to state government, but the way state government relates to local government. Yes, ma'am?
It's very important to remind everybody that this year on the ballot in November will be a question of whether we want to reopen the state constitution and rewrite it or not. And that comes up every so many years.
That's correct. I think it's every 60 or something like that. I don't remember exactly the number, but yeah, no, I'm sorry. Well, it would be 60 years since we last did it, but the actual option comes up more frequently. We'll talk about that in a minute here when we get to state governments. In fact, we're about 2 minutes from. So federalism, right, is this sharing of powers, right? State constitutions serve the same function that the federal constitution does, and that it lays out to a great extent how that state's government works. Now, there's a lot of agreement between our state constitutions, though there are some variances and a few that are kind of out there. We have a couple of unicameral houses. We have some interesting arrangements when it comes to things like term limits and governors and systems of taxation, right? One of the things that makes some of those southern states so popular is they don't have an income tax, right, as opposed to states that do. So these are things that are left up to the state governments and are capable of being assigned through the state constitution. What's important to note is that we've had 27, 28 amendments, right, for the federal constitution? Not that many. State constitutions get amended all the time. We've never had a federal constitutional convention to rewrite the federal constitution. Partially because it would put everything on the table, right? And at no point in time has anyone ever been comfortable with kind of product of what would happen if every single part of the federal constitution were suddenly basically tossed. And you can put it back in if you want it, but you got to get everybody to agree to it again. So there's been a lot of dramatics there. Where the state of Michigan, there's been several different times in which we have rewritten our constitution. I think the most recent one is 1964. Soon enough, recently enough, in fact, that there's some great black and white newsreel footage from those actual meetings that I show to my students. And right after they get over the idea that everyone in the room is smoking, they're really impressed by the idea that you know these people are fundamentally rewriting the state constitution. Also, as things progress, we and the state of Michigan have the power to directly propose amendments to the state constitution and have done so on a pretty regular basis. State constitutions are much more reactive because they have to get a great deal more detailed. Right? The specifics of how a state deals with something is much more likely to be put into constitutional language because the ease of amending them is normally much greater than at the federal level, and the amount of consensus you need to do so is easier to achieve. Right? Also, if you can imagine that we have a federal constitution that sets the rules there, we have a state constitution that sets the rules there, we have, similarly at the local level, county, city, and village charters. Now, not every municipality has a charter, right? A lot of them have fall under what's called general law, which means that the state constitution sets out rules for how these kind of municipalities operate, and unless you take the steps to specifically create a charter for yourself, you will fall under general law. But some places, some municipalities, some townships have taken the steps to create their own charter that gives them more local control, and that is something they are empowered to do. Note something, empowered to do. Because just as the federal government kind of sets aside things that are the provenance of federal government power and gives a bunch to the states, most state constitutions do the exact same thing again. They say, okay, this suite of stuff is specifically the stuff we are going to decide at the state level. But here, counties and municipalities, you get to decide all of these things on your own if you want to. And there are two different philosophies that go with that power share. The first one is home rule. And the difference here is really interesting and important. In a home rule arrangement or in a home rule state, which Michigan largely is, essentially it is like the first part of that 10th Amendment. All right? Essentially saying, unless this is something that you are prohibited from doing, counties and municipalities, you have the power to do it. Right? That is what a home rule state does. You are open check, except for this stuff. The way that I put it to my students in a way they can normally immediately understand is, imagine your parents are going away for a week. Right? Imagine your parents are going away for the week. And they tell you, right, don't break anything, don't get arrested, no more than 5 people in the house at any point in time, don't touch the liquor cabinet. Right? Those are the rules you are given. Right? Does that mean you could have 4 people over to play a board game? Sure. Yeah, that's within the rules, right? That was not prohibited to you. Could you technically grill everything in the freezer? Ha, they didn't say that. Technically you're allowed, right? You probably should, but you would not be breaking a rule if you did, right? That is a home rule arrangement. Now the flip side of that is the Dillon rule arrangement. And Dillon rule is the idea that you are only allowed to do the things you are specifically empowered to do, right? Now it's a very different arrangement of power, and might happen if you grilled everything in the freezer at one point in time while your parents were away, right? The next time they leave, it might be like, okay, you can come and go as you need to for school, you can eat specifically what's labeled in the refrigerator, and you can clean yourself, but that is it, that's the end of your list, right? And under that restriction, could you do something like walk the dog? Well, technically, they didn't say I could, so I can't, right? Imagine the difference here, right? You can imagine the difference. You imagine them calling up like, the dog's really upset, he wants to go for a walk, take her for a walk. You didn't tell me I could, right? I mean, you can imagine. And I use that example, right, because that happened. Not necessarily about a dog, but that happened in Dillon rule states. You had communities who were immediately running into this restriction, right? Like you told me I could pass a tax to, fund my surveyor, but you didn't give me the ability to fund a tax to do a library, so I'm stuck. And so they're knocking on the state, hey, you need to fund these libraries. You didn't let me tax for them. Eventually the state's like, okay, here, new statute law, you can do taxes for libraries. Okay, great. What about this drain project? Okay, here's another one, Just like the parent, you can imagine, yes, you can walk the dog. Yes, you can turn on the lights, right? But that wasn't in the original mandate. Right? And that's kind of the difference between a home rule power arrangement and a Dillon rule power arrangement. And you can imagine the philosophical kind of constraint that exists there and how that might evolve over time. As it turns out, many of the home rule states have run into situations where the state government kind of steps in and is like, we didn't say you couldn't do that, but now we're saying it. Don't do that, right? Like don't grill the stuff in the freezer. And on the flip side, Dillon rule states have become more permissive over time. But that is an important aspect of understanding that relationship between state and local power, right? So at a core, then, what you have is you have elected officials at all levels of government who are performing a lot of the exact same roles on different scales, right? So if we're talking about those core roles, you have legislators, people who make laws. You have executives, people who enact laws. You have judicials, people who interpret laws. Here you have administrative functions too. Some of this is in the executive branch at the federal level, but you have people who just facilitate the operations of government, right? And you have law enforcement capacity, which is more relevant on the state and local level. And just for quick review, you can see here the president is our executive, the vice president is executive and legislative. Remember why? Right? President of the Senate, right? Can break that gives them a legislative role, right? The Senate is legislative, the House is legislative. You'll notice here, since we talked about these being elected officials, the Supreme Court's not on the list, because they're not elected by us. So, or really anybody else. But we take these same roles, let's take a look now at what we might normally see on the statewide. We have a governor, that's an executive, mirroring the president. You've got a lieutenant governor, they're executive and legislative. You can probably guess why. Because under our Constitution, the lieutenant governor also serves essentially as the president of the Senate and can break ties in the Michigan government, right? You've got the Senate and the House of Representatives in the state of Michigan. Anybody know? I'm guessing someone in this room knows, right? There's 100 senators at the federal level and 435 representatives. What we got in the state of Michigan?
38 and 110.
That's exactly correct. 38 and 110. Well done, sir. Yes, we have 38 senators and 110 representatives. Note one difference, right? These are technically overlapping districts, right? You have 110 district representatives for your House. Unlike in the federal level where you've only got 2 per state, here there are geographic districts for our state senators as well, right? So you might have a state senator who technically has the districts of 1, 2, or maybe even more than 2 representatives within their state Senate territory. Okay. You have our Supreme Court, that's judicial. Wait, what? Supreme Court. We elect our Supreme Court justices in this state on a nonpartisan ballot, right? You have an Attorney General. What's the Attorney General's job? Yeah, I mean, they are the primary law enforcement officer in the state of Michigan by constitutional statute, and they are our primary prosecutor, right? Secretary of State's administrative position, right? What do? Right? Keep the operations functional, right? Going on to the DMV or something along the Secretary of State's office here, but it's, you know, everywhere else it's called the DMV, right? Keep records, facilitate elections, things along those lines. We also in this state elect a couple of other key roles, right? The Board of Education, State Board of Education is an elected position in the state of Michigan, and they have a largely legislative role in that they create policy. And then we have university regents in the state of Michigan that have both feasibly legislative and administrative roles. Generally, the executive roles get devolved out to the presidents of the individual universities that they are otherwise overseeing. But you'll note that there is a difference. Not every university elects its regents in this state. I believe we've got, Wayne State, Michigan State. I believe in the primaries, remember there's one more.
That's it.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So, but that also means like Eastern, Western, Central, GVSU, Northern, Ferris. You know, our regents are appointed by the governor. Okay.
Judicials don't have a term limit, but there is an age beyond which they may not run for re-election.
Yes, and that is a
local or
yep,
state
and
level.
that is a measure governed in the state constitution that we ourselves have set and could otherwise change should we choose. Right? So, but you can see how this mirrors in some ways what we see at the federal level. Different elected officials, similar roles. Yes?
There's no Attorney General at the federal level?
Not an elected one. Right? They are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate.
And in the Constitution?
In the Constitution, not documented. I mean, that is a thing that has been put forward over time and established as a cabinet level office. You will not see any of the cabinet level offices in constitutional language, at least not in the initial articles. There's some references that come up in some of the amendments. But yeah, no, cabinet level offices are not established, which is why we can feasibly create and or remove them, usually by acts of Congress, right? Most of the cabinet level offices and cabinet level agencies were created by Congress in order to carry out functions for the executive branch. Another argument that many would kind of point at the idea that Congress is the prime kind of actor as elucidated in the original constitutional language. Yes?
It's a silly question, but is Attorney General thought of as like judicial or executive?
So it's generally thought of as a executive position, right? Because it's normally created by statute, kind of organized underneath or alongside the office of governor, but they really are independent in a law enforcement capacity. Kevin?
Could you illustrate how the president has control as the executive office over the various cabinet level administrative offices, so that under the powers of the executive, they can administer how HUD or EPA operates, as opposed to Congress directing those offices.
Sure.
So sometimes decisions that are made on the executive level, we don't know who's accountable,
Right.
but it comes from the top.
Right, so fundamentally, when Congress creates a law, perhaps they would create something like, in this case, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, right? Congress does not act itself in a supervisory capacity over that. That's not their job, right? Once they have created this agency, that agency normally exists within the executive branch, right? And the president is then responsible for populating that agency and, in a titular way, making sure that that agency is upholding the laws put forward by Congress, which is one of the reasons why the head of that agency, if they are named into a cabinet position, is someone who is chosen by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. So mechanically, all of the different parts of that agency, all of the different employees that exist within it, are members of the executive branch. Right? They're members of that agency, and their job is to carry out the law that Congress has written. So if that means that they need to do something like, ensure certain housing standards or certain housing practices, then you might have everything from investigators to inspectors to evaluators to policy writers and kind of legal advocates and scholars who are employed by that agency to carry out that function. And if you're trying to carry out that function in every community across the country, that agency might get really big really quick. We'll talk about that in just a minute. All right, but that functionally is how these things work. Congress creates an institution through statute law. That institution then gets fleshed out under the executive, and the executive is responsible for making sure that law created by Congress is put into effect. That's their job. That's what the executive is supposed to do. Kevin, one more time.
My follow-up point was that it seems that nowadays the executive, the president, can determine how to execute the laws in that or the budgets within those agencies.
Right.
And so, as opposed to following strict law, the president can say, oh, this is going to be our policy and this is how I'm going to administer that agency.
So there's differing arguments as to whether or not agency independence is wise or warranted. To some extent, the president's got a lot on the plate already. So the idea of the president kind of reaching down into these various different cabinet agencies and making, numerous different nuanced or policy level decisions is not necessarily common, but there is precedent for it because technically these are executive agencies under the president. It would be within the president's authority to do that. The frequency with which they do it, the degree to which the people who are helming those agencies are competent, capable, and otherwise versed in them varies wildly, right? There's a regular kind of debate sometimes about who heads those agencies, whether or not the president should be able to have whoever the president wants regardless of their qualifications, or if the Congress, specifically the Senate, should be filtering those selections based off of other criteria like expertise at the job or documented morality or something like that, or absence of felony convictions, whatever, right? That may be a filter by which you want those nominees to pass, right? But there's also folks who think, even if those things exist and people get second chances, if this person's really good, the president wants them. Sometimes if you happen to fall into that partisan system of representation and the president's the leader of your party, you're willing to kind of pass that along and give the president what he or she wants. Okay, so back to this real quick then. We have our statewide roles here. Again, note, function, mirrored, down the chain. We bounce down to the county level. There's more roles. And many of them fit some of the same patterns, right? Your county commission is largely your legislative body. You've got administrative roles for things like your clerks, your treasurer, your register of deeds, your county surveyor. You've got law enforcement positions. Now you've got both a prosecutor and a sheriff, right, who can function on this level. And note, there's a couple of really fun anomalies on this list that I would normally get into in greater detail because they're neat to talk about. But the drain commissioner is a really interesting position. The drain commissioner has some weird, broad powers that don't fit the rest of the model here, right? They have the power to set policy. They have the power to functionally kind of hire and fire people within their own organization. They have the power to designate specific districts and kind of create these whole bodies that are not normally held by a single individual. And there is a little bit of a study regarding this phenomenon. Kind of like the more limited your portfolio, sometimes the more expansive your power within it can be. And in this case, the drain commissioner is a really unique example. Like they have a very limited amount of things that they're doing, but within those they have sweeping power. within their geographic territory. It's a really unique institution. In some ways, the County Road Commission has some similar degrees of flexibility, that they're acting in terms of creating policy, administrating things, and they're the executive. Yes?
In Muskegon County, we've renamed it the Water Resources.
Yes.
Commission, rather than Drain Commission.
Yes, there's a couple of different places that will have slightly different names under these, and that's just an example of county level kind of sovereignty, right? Now, truth, yeah, right. It gives a better idea, because some people just think, you're standing in your sink and this is Clark, the Drain Commission, right? Right. They're not thinking about drainage in terms of the entire county or whether or not you've got standing water, right? They expect the Drain Commissioner is going to show up with a plunger and a snake or something, right? No, totally different thing. Way more powerful than that, actually. Though that might get you elected if you were trying to run for water resources. But again, it's a lot of the same kind of mirroring at the county level, right? So we're coming down the chain here and getting closer and closer to local. In fact, we're about to get really close to local. Townships. Anybody know how the township system is set up in Michigan? On a fundamental level, it's you take the county and you cut it into 16 equal pieces. That's how we set up the townships in Michigan, right? Imagine a perfectly square county and draw line, that's it. 16 equal pieces. That's how you ended up with townships in the state of Michigan. Now, obviously, not every county is square and things get complicated. And there are some places in the state of Michigan in which the township level government has been effectively removed because you have a municipality that extends the entire township and then some, right? So there are a few cases where that happens. But at the township level, you have trustees, right? That perform the legislative function. Note, in the state of Michigan, depends on the population of the township. If your population is less than 5,000, you're only going to have 2 trustees. If it's more than 5,000, you can actually go through a process to go before, right? And because your township board then consists of those individual trustees, as well as your supervisor, clerk, and treasurer, you have between 5 and 7 total kind of county or township officers at that point. Also, though I have never seen one personally, there is in Michigan, the Michigan Constitution, the opportunity for townships to mark constables that can serve effectively in a law enforcement policy. Again, I've never seen one personally, but I'm certain there are still some that are out there. But that is something that the township has the ability to do, and that would give them a law enforcement function. Here, because of the nature of township government, frequently the supervisor is going to be your primary administrative and executive body, but you've got shared kind of legislative responsibilities across all of your township officers. Now we get down to municipal, right? So we're coming close. If that municipality is a city, there are some rules, but that municipality could be a village, right? That could be a chartered village. And so you might have your, most of them now are council members. There are still a few commissioners within the state, and the difference there we'll get into in a second, but these council members and commissioners have legislative responsibilities. They're the ones that are creating policy and setting policy for the municipality itself. You can have either a mayor or a village president as an executive, independently elected. Some of these other systems where you've got a commission, the mayor will technically be elected out of the commission. That's one of the primary differences there. You can have a city manager, depending on the circumstances, who is normally an administrative position, frequently unelected, appointed. That's one thing I wanted to kind of point out on this, but you can have a clerk that can be elected municipally, treasurer, and then you've got school boards. School boards are not in and of themselves municipal agencies, right? But they're generally elected at the same scale that you would see municipalities. Frequently they will have overlapping district boundaries with municipalities and otherwise be named in similar ways to a municipality. It gets a little more complex when you start looking at things like county ISDs and larger groups like that. But school boards are generally conducted on this kind of a scale. What does that mean? Well, what this means is that we talked about the federal positions and the electeds, right? 535 members of Congress, the president and the vice president. That's all we're electing at the federal level, right? So 537 total human beings. There's a lot more government than what's going on at the federal level. In fact, so much more, this is the part where my students normally kind of lose the thread. Because this is what government really looks like. There's one federal government. There's 50 state governments. Across the country, there's about 3,100 county-level governments. 19,500 municipalities, over 13,000 school districts, and over 40,000 special districts of government. These can be fire districts, water sewer districts, transit districts, hospital districts, parks and recreation districts, airports, the special development authorities, all different types of structured government that will elect individuals and empower them to take care of various different policies as created by county, municipal, and state statute law. What that means is that when you talk about government, if you're only talking about the federal government, you are talking about 1 in 90,000. Over 90,000 different types of government structures across the country. And that's not yet to the people. One of the things I was asked to address in this was the idea of public service. Well, public service is not just representation. There are a good number of elected officials, right? We talked about those 537 at the federal level, right, that are elected officials. 2.2 million federal employees on the civilian side. 630,000 postal employees, which is a public-private partnership organized by the federal government. Active duty military personnel of about 1.3 million. There are about 4.2 million people across the country who are part of the federal government, who are part of federal public service. We elect 537. So we talk about government, we talk about systems, we talk about bureaucracy, we talk about service. Most people thought, I don't want to run for office. Good. There's not that many offices to be had. Right? However, there are numerous opportunities for us to work and function and give our time, effort, sometimes blood and tears, to the operation of government. But let's go even further, because that's the federal level, right? I don't see any federal electeds in the room at the moment, right? Not that White Lake doesn't deserve it, but that's not what we're talking about right now. Let's get down to what the real scope of public service is in terms of the state of Michigan. Right now, this is small print, I apologize, but there's a lot here. We have about 250 statewide elected officials, right? The 148 legislators, so accurately depicted, 110 members of the House, 38 members of the Senate. We have about an additional 8,100 statewide executives. Remember all of the different boards and judges and things like that that get elected at the state level. So we've got about 250 total elected officials that are statewide, Lansing level elected officials. We have about 83 counties, right, across the state of Michigan, meaning that between the boards and judges of those counties, there's another 600 to 900 people who serve in county level elected positions. Townships, we have 1,240 townships, right? Remember, all the counties cut to 16. We lose a few, we get a few. But what that ends up meaning is that we have between 7,500 and 8,500 township level elected positions. Municipally, 800 plus municipalities, mayors, council members, various difference, between 5,000 and 7,000 elected officials at the municipal level. School boards across the state, 800 plus school boards, 7-ish members per 5,500 to 6,000. Meaning that across the state of Michigan, there's between 18,000 and 22,000 human beings who are elected by their peers to serve in the apparatus of government on some level. It's a lot more than the 250 who are sitting in Lansing. And by the way, the number here, in terms of the exact same metrics for every state in the union, you add them all together, it's over 500,000 people are elected to office in the United States and are conducting some part of service. Most of that service is nonpartisan. Most of that service is boring. A lot of it's administrative, but all of it is required for the function of government to actually deliver on anything that it has otherwise been constructed to deliver and promises to the people. One more bit that I find particularly useful when I'm thinking about the scope of public service. In the state of Michigan, there are 186,000 employees of the state government. Right? 186,000 human beings, our friends and neighbors, are working under the apparatus of state government in everything from, inspecting, our homes to inspecting our food, right? And for, working with the federal elements. There's another 395,000 employees in local government. 395,000, right? Folks, some of you may be, either there or retired from there or know somebody who does. The vast majority of those local government employees, by the way, are either educators or people who are employed in public safety in some capacity. Right? There are about 54,000 federal employees who live in Michigan. It's kind of already accounted. But what that means is that there's about 635,000 people in the state of Michigan who are employed by either the state or federal government or one of the local apparatuses of government, the county, township, or municipal government. And if we take that number across the United States, it's over 20 million Americans. Now, one of the lessons of civics is the idea that we can't just look at those 537 people who are sitting on the Hill in Washington and frequently pissing us off, right? When we consider what government and public service is. The vast majority of government is not that. The vast majority of government is human beings in your neighborhoods with jobs and families who are working boring, simple, but incredibly important jobs, delivering services, guaranteeing that our people are protected, making sure our children are educated, making sure that your water is clean and your roads are clear. Right? And so, if I can give you one kind of summary lesson from Civics 101, is that one, understanding how all of this works is really important, and there are numerous opportunities for controversy and concern, but also not letting those very important issues remove from our appreciation all of these other entities in government, all of these non-controversial elements of government that literally keep the lights on. There will always be opportunities for disagreement, reform. There are always ways in which things can be made better or less corrupt. But every time we pick up that pen, or every time we pick up that hatchet, right, and we are looking at rewriting or changing things, the fact that one party or another is behind or opposed to it does not necessarily matter when it changes the fundamentals of public service for so many of our friends and neighbors.